We are now up to question 87 of the Summa Theologian. Prima pars, thank you for journeying through the Summa with me. And in question 87, we are still talking about basically human epistemology, the knowledge of the soul. And St. Thomas Aquinas has already covered what the soul can know of things above itself and below itself. And now he kind of turns inward and talks about how the intellectual soul knows itself and all within itself. And, as I look at this topic and this title, I can't help but think of somebody like Rene Descartes, I think therefore I am, which was basically the beginning of modern philosophy when he said that with his meditations. And so I don't know if this is exactly an influence on Descartes, but it's still that same kind of internal looking at the processes of knowledge and how one can know himself or herself. And so hopefully you'll find these interesting. There's 4 articles, shouldn't take too long. Article 1 says whether the intellectual soul knows itself by its essence. And what you're going to find in these 4 articles that St. Thomas Aquinas is going to do a lot of differentiating between the different types of beings that have intellect, mainly God, the angels, and the human beings. Now I say beings and not creatures, because God, of course, isn't a creature. And that's what he's going to do in this first article here. He says, first of all, everything is knowable as far as it is in act, and not so far as it is in potentiality. Now, that's something that we learned way back in question 3 of the Summa, when we talked about God's simplicity, is that he is the pure active being, and God has absolutely no potentiality. Nothing can happen to God. He's just pure act. And and he's the only one, the only being that is that way. For a thing is a being and is true and therefore knowable according as it is actual. And that is why St. Thomas Aquinas determined that God is the most knowable being of all, because he is pure act, right? This is quite clear as regards sensible things, for the eye does not see what is in potentiality, but what is actually colored. Okay, we can't see something that's potential, like, for example, a child that's going to potentially be born next year. We don't see them yet, right? Because they're not born yet. They don't have any actuality. In like manner, it is clear that the intellect, so far as it knows material things, does not know save what is in act, and hence it does not know primary matter except as proportionate to form. Now, if you remember what primary matter is, that's basically matter before it is attached to a form, so to speak. So it's in potentiality. It's a really interesting concept. We already talked about that in a previous video. Consequently, immaterial substances are intelligible by their own essence according as each one is actual by its own essence. So this is the distinction that he's going to make here, is how actual are these immaterial substances like God, like the angels, and also the human intellect, which is an immaterial substance as well, and that's going to determine how into what manner it can know itself. Therefore, it is that the essence of God, the pure and perfect act, is simply and perfectly in itself intelligible, and hence God by his own essence knows himself and all other things also. This is the key distinction. God knows himself through his essence, but he also knows everything else. Every single thing, past, present, future, contingent, possible, you name it. God knows everything in one instant, in eternal now. Okay, and that's unique to God. The angelic essence belongs indeed to the genus of intelligible things as act, but not as pure act. So here he's making a distinction between the angelic mind and God, who is knowledge itself, nor as a complete act, and hence the angel's act of intelligence is not completed in his essence. The angel doesn't know everything, past, future, present, like God does in a single moment. But their intellects are more advanced than ours are, right? For although an angel understands himself by his own essence, still he can understand all other things by his own essence. For he knows things other than himself by their likenesses. They are infused into the angels, and so only through God infusing this knowledge into the angel does it know these things. Now, the human intellect is only a potentiality in the genus of intelligible beings. Now he's making a distinction between the human being in our knowledge and the angels, who are are act and infused with knowledge, so they get it all at the same time, whereas we are born like blank slates, and we kind of learn things as we go along discursively, right? Just as primary matter is a potentiality as regards sensible beings, and hence it is possible. So he's comparing here the human intellect to primary matter, which is potential to form something, and the human intellect potentially knows something, but you have to go through the process of abstraction and all these things we talked about with human epistemology. Therefore, in its essence, the human mind is potentially understanding. Hence it is that in itself it has the power to understand, but not to be understood except as it is made actual. Okay, so we are the lowest of the intellectual substances, as we've talked before. But as in this life, our intellect has material and sensible things for its proper natural object. As stated above, it understands itself according as it is made actual by the species abstracted from sensible things through the light of the active intellect, which not only actuates the intelligible things themselves, but also by their instrumentality actuates the passive intellect. So he's saying here that we come to know things, we know intelligible species through our experience with the physical world. We know dogs because we saw a dog. We know what a sunset is because we've seen a sunset. And that's how our minds work, through potentially learning things as we go through life. Therefore, the intellect knows itself not by its essence, but by its act. So as we come to exercise the passive and the active intellect, that's how we come to know ourselves, through the act. This happens in two ways. In the first place, singularly, is when Socrates or Plato perceives that he has an intellectual soul because he perceives that he understands. Okay, this is where I think it kind of sounds like Rene Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Very similar, actually. In fact, I'm sure Rene Descartes was reading the Summa and stole some of this from Aquinas. In the second place, universally, as when we consider the nature of the human mind from knowledge of the intellectual act. It is true, however, that the judgment and form of this knowledge, whereby we know the nature of the soul, comes to us according to the derivation of our intellectual light from the divine truth which contains the type of all things. That's really important, that we come to know things, and by conforming our mind to the exterior world, which contains the forms that are in the divine mind, the eternal types, we are coming to know God through our experience of the created world, and coming to know God through the world. Then he has a great quote from Augustine. He says, "We gaze on the inviolable truth whence we can as perfectly as possible define not what each man's mind is, but what it ought to be in the light of the eternal types." Really beautiful quote from Augustine there, saying that our mind conforms to the objects that we understand in conformity to the eternal types that originate in the mind of God and these eternal types. And I will say, unlike Descartes, who threw out all sense knowledge, he, in his method of extreme doubt, said he couldn't trust the senses. Aquinas is saying just the opposite. He's saying we come to know everything through the senses. This is an integrated approach to epistemology, and not a one-sided approach like Rene Descartes subscribed to. Article 2, whether our intellect knows the habits of the soul by their essence. And in this one, he's basically going to say okay, I'll read it. He says a habit is a kind of medium between power and act. And it has been said that nothing is known but as it is actual. Therefore, so far as a habit fails in being a perfect act, it falls short of being in itself knowable, and can be known only by its act. Thus, for example, anyone knows he has a habit from the fact that he can produce the act proper to that habit. Okay, so a little bit obscure, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but anyways, we've talked about habits being the medium between power and act. Article 3, whether our intellect knows its own act. Now, this is kind of interesting because I find Aquinas kind of repeating a little bit of what he said in Article 1, because again, he's going to compare the divine, the angelic, and the human intellects with regard to this. And so it's kind of similar to Article 1 in many ways, but I'll go ahead and read it because I think it's important to make that distinction of how we're different from the angels. He says, "A thing is intelligible according as it is in act. Now, the ultimate perfection of an intellect consists in its own operation. For this is not an act tending to something else in which lies the perfection of the work accomplished, as building is the perfection of the thing built, but it remains in the agent as its perfection and act." And what he's saying here is that when we come to know things, they become a part of us. Okay, when we know things in nature, things like, whatever, a dog or a cat, that knowledge is in us. It becomes a part of us. We've conformed our mind to the world. And again, we're having a relationship with the eternal types and coming to know something about God through the act of our intelligence. Therefore, the first thing understood of the intellect is its own act of understanding. This occurs in different ways in different intellects. Now, here's what he's going to start comparing God and the angels and man. For there is an intellect, namely the divine, which is its own act of intelligence, so that in God the understanding of his intelligence and the understanding of his essence are one and the same act. Everything is the same in God. He is the pure act of being. Everything. Okay, the only reason that things are separated with God is in order for us to understand him better, because his essence is his act of understanding. But there is another intellect, the angelic, which is not its own act of understanding, and yet the first object of that act is the angelic essence. Wherefore, although there is a logical distinction between act whereby he understands that he understands and that whereby he understands his essence, yet he understands both by one and the same act. So you're seeing this hierarchy going from God, who is pure act of being, to the angel, who is very close to God in the way that he understands things, right? Because to understand his own essence is the proper perfection of his essence. And by one and the same act, it is a thing together with its perfection understood. And there is yet another, namely the human intellect, which neither is its own act of understanding, nor is its own essence the first object of its act of understanding. Okay, we are way down there when it comes to the types of intellectual creatures or beings. For this object is the nature of a material thing, and therefore that which is first known by the human intellect is an object of this kind, and that which is known secondarily is the act by which that object is known. Now, as you hear this, it may sound kind of complicated, but one thing that's very important to understand is that we are complicated creatures. God is simple. In fact, that's the first attribute that St. Thomas Aquinas attaches to God. He's simple, purely simple. The angels are much simpler than us, where they don't have bodies, they don't have passions, they don't have sensitive desires. We are complicated. We're also very unique and special in the way that we come to know things. And this is what Thomas is highlighting here. And through the act of intellect itself is known, the perfection of which is this act of understanding. For this reason did the philosopher assert that objects are known before acts and acts before powers. Okay, so if you're still kind of scratching your head a little bit and saying that's confusing, well, welcome to the club, okay, because it is a little bit confusing. Whether the intellect understands the act of the will. The act of the will is nothing but an inclination consequent on the form understood. So in order for us to desire something intellectually, which is the definition of the will, we have to first apprehend it with the intellect. We have to know that it's there, right? We can't desire marriage. We can't desire the priesthood or desire graduating from college unless we first know what it is, right? So in that way, the intellect precedes the will. Just as the natural appetite is an inclination consequent on the natural form. Now, the inclination of a thing resides in it according to its mode of existence, and hence the natural inclination resides in a natural thing naturally. And the inclination called the sensible appetite is in the sensible thing sensibly. And likewise, the intelligible inclination, which is the act of the will, is in the intelligent subject intelligibly, as in its principal and proper subject. Hence the philosopher expresses himself thus, saying, the will is in the reason. What he's getting at here is that the intellect and the will are so tied together that you can't really separate them. And of course, the intellect understands the act of the will because it's providing the will with that which it is intellectually desiring. So of course, he's going to say so therefore the act of the will is understood by the intellect, both inasmuch as one knows that one wills, and inasmuch as one knows the nature of this act. Okay, so I know some of that was kind of complicated, but again, hopefully you're picking up on some of this. It's making sense, and if nothing else, it's an opportunity for us to introspect a little bit and perhaps ask some questions that we otherwise may not have asked before, like what does the soul know of itself and all within itself? All right, thank you for joining me. This has been question 87 of the Summa Theologia, and I appreciate you journeying through the Summa with me, one question at a time. St. Thomas Aquinas, pray for us. God bless you.